Welcome. This is Knowledge Melbourne's very first live streamed Melbourne conversation. Despite the extraordinary circumstances that we are finding ourselves in meeting like this today, welcome to my living room, Prue and Ben. We hope this conversation does allow us to focus on what matters most, which is connecting with each other and sharing knowledge and conversation. On behalf of the City of Melbourne, before we launch in, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Boon Wurrung and the Woi Wurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay our respect to their elders past and present. We will be taking questions from the audience via online channels throughout the event. You can submit your questions throughout the conversation on the Facebook live stream, and these will be relayed to me toward the end of the event. We'll have time for these toward the end. So welcome to the new news. Is the art of journalism dead is our first question. And if so, is that a bad thing? Australians consume less news than the global average, with 57% of us getting our news online. In the past 40 years, the landscape of news media has transformed beyond recognition, with fears of fake news and other concerns. But are there solutions, and what are the opportunities? So allow me to just briefly introduce myself. I'm an audio host and reporter. My name is Elizabeth Coulas. I've worked across a number of audio programs in the US and Australia, including NPR's Planet Money, Gimlet Media's Reply All podcast, and Schwartz Media's 7am. Tonight, joining us, we have Dr. Ben Eltham, a lecturer in Media and Communications at Monash University School of Media, Film and Journalism. Ben, thank you. Ben's covered federal politics for over a decade as the National Affairs correspondent at Matilda, and is a regular contributor to journals such as Crikey, Guardian Australia, Overland, and New Engine. We also have joining us tonight Prue Clark. Prue, thank you for being here. Prue is Senior Executive Officer at the Judith Neilson Institute based in Sydney. Prue is a journalist and media development specialist, and her reporting and commentary from 6 continents has appeared in the Washington Post, The Guardian, New York Times, and the BBC. Prue led BBC's radio programming in West Africa during the 2014 Ebola crisis, and she co-founded New Narratives, an NGO that's raised more than $3 million for investigative journalism in Africa. Prue returns to Australia after 19 years in New York, London, and West Africa. Okay, all the introductions and things out of the way. We seem to have lost Ben along the way. Prue, do you mind if we get started anyway, and hope that Ben joins us when he finds his way back online?
Absolutely.
Okay, so Prue, we certainly want to get into the future of journalism in this conversation, but I wanted to see if we could start right where we are at this moment, in the middle of a global pandemic. Australians may be experiencing this very much for the first time. And I think COVID-19 and its global spread is in some ways blocking our view of what the future might look like. Find ourselves right in the midst of it. We, of course, observed and reported on the Ebola crisis in Liberia and Lebanon in 2014. And the BBC charity, BBC Media Action, which was looking and aimed at training West African media and leaders in Ebola health messaging. I wanted to start with you, if I could, to see what sort of parallels you're finding and differences in that experience at this moment, and also how you think Australian media is handling this at present.
So thank you very much, Elizabeth, for having me tonight. There's so many parallels from the experience in Ebola in West Africa. I think it started very much the way it started here. There was a lot of the same media spreading of rumours, sensational headlines. I mean, we're a business at the end of the day, you know, and I think it took a while for everyone to really understand the scale of it, which we can see happening here, I think. It started in Sierra Leone in about April. And the BBC had a lot of staff across the region, so we were watching it very closely. And it wasn't really until about July that a huge international effort swung in. And it was because, we're talking about 3 war-torn countries that had very weak health systems. And so they'd been dependent on international support for a long time. So suddenly in came the CDC, the World Health Organization, UNICEF, and the countries were sort of willing to hand themselves over to that. And that, so we're talking about basically handing over to the experts, which has not happened to the same extent here. And very quickly, the goal was to get clear, consistent messaging out through the media, through the journalists, but also in public education campaign. So I was surprised to see how long it took to get that public education campaign going here. I was personally going around saying, do not shake hands, but you really needed it from the government. But the other thing we learned very clearly in Ebola was that people don't trust politicians there any more than they do here. And so we had to find people that people trusted at every level. And, in that case, it was often religious leaders, it was sports people, soccer players primarily. And I think you can clearly see that that's happening here too, where, I think different generations are getting the messages differently. And, if you look at the pictures of Bondi Beach and other places, it tended to be, people under 40 who were ignoring the messages to some extent. And I haven't seen any effort to get messages to them from trusted sources in methods that or channels that they are used to. So, I think it's interesting to see those two differences where, Australia was one of the countries that funded the huge public education and communications campaign in West Africa, but then didn't listen to the experts and implement the same strategy here. So it's been interesting to see that to some extent, I think Western countries have failed in a way that countries in the developing world didn't.
When you speak to sort of the search for other experts, when the government messaging fails, I'm wondering, of course, Norman Swan has been leading one part of the Australian public, a lot of people tuning in and sort of looking at his messaging, and they've been kind of, in some ways, veiled statements from government leaders about not looking over there and looking over here. I know in the US, Anthony Fauci, the expert, the health expert, has just done an Instagram Q&A with the basketballer Steph Curry. So maybe some of those sort of methods and mechanisms. Steph Curry has 30 million Instagram followers. They're in a core demographic that probably hasn't been targeted by COVID messaging up until this point. So I think they're interesting points. What about the public's trust in the media to supply that message to them, though?
Well, look, it's really worrying, isn't it? I mean, we were talking about that survey, the Guardian survey earlier this week, saying that 35% of people, I think, thought it was not a big coronavirus, was not something or that the reaction had been overblown, and that a lot of people wouldn't trust the media. And this is when it really, comes to the crunch. People will lose their lives because people haven't trusted the media. And that certainly happened in West Africa. And, it's sad to see it happening here to some extent. But, it is in so many ways, I think, we are suffering because of a lack of trust in the media. But this is when it's so crystallized at this moment where we needed people to behave in a certain way. We needed to have trusted messages coming from journalists, not mixed messages, and some clarity. And if people don't trust the media, then they don't. This is the conduit to get the facts out there. And if it's not happening, and we're seeing a very real time impact of that lack of trust in the media. And it's symptomatic of so many more problems, I think, beyond that.
Arguably, of course, when we need them most, unfortunately.
Right.
Ben, the government messaging hasn't been all that much clearer. We've had not only differing messages, not only daily but hourly, from the federal government, but then also the way that interacts with state jurisdictions and things that the state's in control of, schools being a strongest example. I'm wondering if sort of first what your opinion is about what the media's role is when mixed messages from government seem to just keep on coming, and whether or not the media's role needs to change in a moment like this to adapt to the reality of a pandemic spread.
Yeah, well, I think this comes, against a background of the erosion of trust in most of our social institutions really now over the course of maybe a couple of decades, and that's due to some outside socioeconomic trends. Media is certainly part of that, but it's not the only institution that's seen a dramatic erosion of trust over the last, say, 10 to 20 years. The media obviously has a role to play in our public sphere, a very important role in order to mediate public discussion and debate about the kind of society we live in, the kind of political decisions our leaders make. But also, the media is uniquely, I think, at the moment, ill prepared for the current situation because it's particularly weak in economic terms. There are fewer journalists than there were 5 years or 10 years ago. There's less ability for the media to hold our leaders to account. And on top of that, the media is also basically allowed the most important distribution channels of news and information to be captured by a small number of billionaires, largely based in Silicon Valley. So the media no longer really controls the mode of distribution for news information in our society. And because of that, I think the media is quite vulnerable to not just to fake news, and we can get into a discussion about what fake news is and is not perhaps later in this discussion, but all of the other types of disinformation, misinformation, and partial information that have always been with us ever since we've had cultural industries and publishing and news media, but which are particularly salient in the current situation, current crisis.
Ben, when I was reading earlier this week, the editor of Guardian Australia, Lenore Taylor, wrote a piece on Sunday, sort of outlining what the challenge is that's facing news media right now. She said this moment covering the COVID-19 spread is a defining challenge for news media. And she shared what she saw as some of those challenges. She's saying, quote, how should we balance legitimate questioning of government decisions with the danger of further undermining public faith in expert advice and institutions? If we do find ourselves then in that moment, she says, quote, when does legitimate scrutiny cross the line to become counterproductive? Has the media's role, or does the media's role need to change in this moment? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, Elizabeth. Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. And of course, Lenore is a distinguished journalist and editor. I think the question about when it crosses the line is a really difficult one. Basically, one of the problems is, you've got a situation where obviously public health is at stake here and potentially millions of lives are potentially at stake. So there's an issue there around about what is the media's responsibility in reporting accurately and reporting what the government claims to be the best medical advice. But of course, as we've seen in the United Kingdom, there's also a legitimate scrutiny that needs to be exerted on exactly that public health advice. We saw in the United Kingdom, once we found out about the modelling that the United Kingdom was using, it was informing a policy that potentially might lead to the infection of millions of people and the deaths of tens or even hundreds of thousands of people. The United Kingdom government had to change course. It had to change course rapidly. And that was because of media scrutiny on the public health advice and the epidemiological strategies that the Johnson government was undertaking. So I think you could argue that there's a role for the media to be responsible, and I'd always argue that. But there's an even greater role, I think, for the media to exert democratic scrutiny in this time more than ever, I would think.
Prue, did you have something to add to that? Because, of course, we can all agree thorough, factual, timely reporting that holds power to account, that are bedrocks of good journalism. But do we need to qualify that in a moment like this?
Yeah, it is a difficult question, and some people will fall on the side of, we need to just sort of support the government in moments like this. But I absolutely agree that the media has a very important role in scrutinising government activities. I mean, because the government does have, everyone has an agenda in this, including the public health officials who aren't seeing it across the board. They're not taking the economic damage into account. The politicians also have, their own interests. So I think our role is triply important in that sense. But what I don't think we should be doing is seeing everything through a political lens. Asking whether there's sort of been some infighting in the cabinet before or between the premiers and the prime ministers at the start of an interview, in the moment of a crisis. I think that's the stuff that really turns off listeners and also doesn't necessarily help us keep the attention and the scrutiny on the decision makers at the moment.
So how is Australian media performing so far? If you had to sort of give feedback on media's performance in covering COVID-19, its spread, and how we should as a culture come together to figure out how to work together to combat it.
I mean, look, I have probably not watched enough to give a full assessment, but I have seen, some news alerts that came up in my Facebook feed saying someone at Castle Hill, David Jones, has been tested positive for, corona. Everyone who's shopped there in the last 7 days should be on alert. That sort of stuff. I'm not sure that that's helpful. I think that there's been a little bit too much politicizing. There has been I have seen a great effort to get the facts right, to get experts out, to be having these conversations and learning. I think I'd like us to go a little bit deeper. And maybe it's too soon, but I feel like a lot of coverage in Australia tends to be a bit too superficial. It's this person says this and this person says that without enough context. And for various reasons, I mean, they're all media houses here are resource strapped and really stretched. I don't feel that we step back and think, what are the knock-on effects? What's the constructive news that we can be telling here? And I mean, the news that people can use, for example. And it's some pieces that I saw in the American media that I thought were helpful was an engaging New York Magazine piece about actually how the virus travels from, the handshake or the coffee that you're having with somebody who's infected, and how it actually travels into your system, and then what happens internally. I found that helpful. And there was another piece saying that 10% of firefighters in California are infected or in isolation right now. What are going to be the knock-on consequences for the bushfire season that's about to start? Things like that we could be asking broader questions than this constant death toll, I think.
Ben, your thoughts about media coverage so far as this has unfolded? Oh, sorry, I think you're muted, Ben. There we go.
Unmute myself. That's a beginner's mistake. It's not been too bad, I think, so far, Elizabeth. There've been better and slightly less good bits of it, but on the whole, I think our media's more or less risen to the challenge. There's been some standout performances, particularly from the ABC, I think, and the Guardian, both of which outlets have done, I think, really good work in trying to demystify aspects of the virus and the illness, and also to present the legitimate public health and expert debates behind the scenes about, what is the seriousness of the threat and the responses, the public health responses by the government. I think it's really interesting to see the kind of Norman Swan effect, if you like, if I could put it like that. The oversized celebrity, even that Norman Swan has, managed to win for himself in this period, and I think that's really, as he himself has pointed out, it's because of a vacuum of sensible, consistent medical advice from the government, and particularly the contradictions and the confusions in the messaging from the federal government. So in that situation, we've seen a trusted source in Swan move to the centre of the debate. Now, there's some arguments about whether Swan is the best person to be presenting public health advice in a crisis like this. But I think that's indicative of the importance of the public health coverage that both Swan and the ABC are providing.
It struck me that some of the best commentary and analysis that I heard probably about a week ago was really looking at the fact that this is going to require a mindset change as so much as a practical response from our community. Can our media provide the kind of bolstering, outlining sacrifice and sort of, I think, psychological support to the community to go through such a massive mental shift alongside a massive practical shift in a time when trust is so diminished? And to that point of trust, prove what can be done. What are strategies for how we can rebuild, and can it be done in a moment of stress like this one?
Yeah, I want to emphasize that it's really hard. It's really hard for the journalists to get their heads around what is happening,
Mm.
um, and let alone the audience. So, um, I'm sure things will improve as we go forward, and people just really start to understand the reality or the size of what we're facing. And I think it is about, I think absolutely Ben is right that we've seen Norman Swan come out as somebody that people trust, and there, that's exactly what we needed to have. We needed to have a consistent, trusted, confident expert who could, but also importantly, could translate the technical terms into things that were very accessible for the average audience. And that is the skill set
Mm.
of beat reporters that we are lacking, and that people have not had the opportunity to spend years and years on this beat. They're sort of landing in it, learning science and medical terms at the last minute, and it's hard. And their lack of knowledge is probably showing up. How do we address that quickly? I mean, we do need to get people need to be learning this stuff quickly. They need to be journalists need to be spending a lot of time really reading the science and understanding the science, talking to the experts, finding the trusted experts. I mean, you mentioned Fauci, and he had been one of the key leaders of the CDC's efforts in Ebola in West Africa, and the CDC, we haven't had a body that had that same resources and role in Australia, I don't think. And I mean, I laughed when I saw a doctor doing a blog on The Guardian, who he looked up if there was a CDC in Australia.
Right. So we're all Googling the same things.
Exactly. And I think that we definitely need to have a crash course in understanding this virus, understanding what we shouldn't do, the risks of spreading information that you haven't tested and don't know the truth of, and we need to do that really fast.
Ben, thoughts
Crack
about
in
trust
there,
building?
Elizabeth. I
Yeah.
mean, I think what this points to actually is the degradation of the expertise in the media. Now, once upon a time, we had specialist health reporters, and we had specialist public policy reporters. I've done quite a lot of public policy reporting myself, and it is a specialization, understanding the interaction between different policy spheres, both legislative, economic, social, and other specialist fields like health or defense or what have you. That's a specialist skill, and to be able to understand that policy domain and to be able to interpret that for your readers or your audience, that's a really important skill. And I think, ideally in a situation like this, we shouldn't have to have journalists boning up quickly on virology, right? Like, it's too late for them if they're having to do that at this point of time. Ideally, what we'd like is people who are already skilled at the particular beat or round that they're working in, and who are in a position to actually interpret the best evidence that we have, and to act as a bridge between the real experts, the actual scientists, the epidemiologists, and the general public, because that's a critical role. We know that oftentimes the general public doesn't particularly well understand science, and it needs communication in order for the science to be understood by the general public. So I think there's a really important role for specialist journalism in a crisis like this. And one of the problems of the last 20 years, of the difficulties that the news media has had over the last 20 years, is that we've eroded our specialist journalism skills.
Ben, that was probably one of the things that hit me most moving from a newsroom in the US to Australia, because you would have someone covering transport in California, for example, or the testing of new transport apps, or someone's beat was AI. And yes, the depth of knowledge, the amount of stories that would come out of giving someone the time and space to look at an area closely, there's nothing like it. Prue, another question, just other strategies about building trust, and they may not be related to this moment, they may not be related to COVID-19. What else can people working in the media, let's say we've got journalists listening to this, is there a part that they can play in attempting to build and rebuild trust with the community? I know that's a lot for one person to take on, but other strategies?
Yeah, I mean, I think there, I'm caveat that I haven't watched the Australian media closely until I got back 9 months ago. And in that time, there have been some things that have stood out to me that I think the accumulation of small things that is undermining trust, and I think we could work on. I'm struck by a lot of insider language, for instance. So, I mean, I'll hear hosts talking about elbow, for instance, and I've brought my American husband with me, and he has no idea who elbow is. I often have to translate the news, and I have to remind myself what that shorthand is, what it actually means, and so you think about anyone, an immigrant. Or an immigrant community, that is going to alienate them from the news to start with. And then just, I hear a lot of sourcing that would, in the States, the New York Times would be pushed to be much more pointed about the sourcing for a story. So we'll often hear it's understood or inside sources, things like that. Whereas the New York Times would be pushed to say they were getting a background briefing from Hillary Clinton when she was the State Department Secretary of State. Sorry, she would be, if she didn't want to go on the record, she would have to be a very highly placed source in the State Department, for instance. And I think we hear when audiences hear, when you don't know where this information's coming from. It makes you immediately suspicious. You want to ask questions. You want to probe it. So it's that's just one other small thing. And there's a lot of opinion in the language too. Even from the ABC, I'll hear the tragedy or the terrible, which again, it just sort of, it's this little thing that irks the reader, I think, or the audience. And we bring the facts and the information. We should leave our opinion out of it. And all of those things are creeping. And it even comes down to this, there is a delivery that is required on Australian television that is, it sounds insincere to me, because, people's natural voice is gone. It's lacking sincerity. And there's this sing-song delivery that everybody is required to take on. I struggle to find anyone on broadcast television in Australia who doesn't have it. So it's just a combination of little things. I think that if we could rethink those, might help, build trust. And then of course there are the bigger things, like so many journalists giving their opinions about politics on Twitter, and lots of media doing things that are aren't journalistic, aren't upholding the values that good journalism is built upon, destroying people's lives unjustly. So, there is a lot of work to be done.
Ben, your point about specialist reporters is a great one, but is the audience and is the market in Australia, is media itself ever going to be large enough, or at least in the foreseeable future, to support that kind of reporting specialisation?
Well, unfortunately, probably not, Elizabeth. The Australian media is shrinking.
So what do we
by
do?
the day, as
Give
we
us
saw
the answers.
as we saw with AAP. Of course, we might still see that AAP gets rescued, but with the likelihood that more than 700 full-time professional journalists will be exiting the industry with the demise of AAP, it's getting worse. This is probably the worst it's been for decades. So no, we don't have the capacity anymore to support those specialist rounds journalists, like a health journalist, that we need now more than ever. It's one of the conundrums of the collapse of the journalism business model over the last 15 years because of the advent of the internet, and the commodification, I should say, of news. So I don't know if there's an easy answer, or there's certainly not a positive answer to this one, unfortunately.
And Ben, you've mentioned that the AAP shut down the Australian Associated Press. They're a newswire service. But that happened early early March. It feels like a year ago now, but it was but a few weeks ago. For people who might not have been following it closely, why does it matter that it's now looking like the service may close or potentially have other owners at some point? It's at this point earmarked to close in June. What does it mean for Australian media to use it, and what do they do?
Oh, it's actually really significant. So AAP is one of those sort of unsung heroes of the Australian mediascape. Most people wouldn't know what AAP is. It's a wire service, so they're kind of a news wholesaler, if you like. The journalists who work for AAP write the news, and then that news then appears under other people's brands or mastheads. So most ordinary news consumers are not aware of the amount of news that's actually reported by AAP, but it's huge. AAP in many cases are the only journalists covering really important aspects of our society and our economy, like magistrates' courts or royal commissions. They're some of the only journalists covering local government and even state government in many cases. So they fill a critical role in the Australian mediascape, and the possibility that all of those journalists might be laid off with the demise of AAP is deeply concerning, I think, for many informed observers of the Australian news media scape.
And that's, as I said, just before a lot of these economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic have really had an even deeper effect and a wider effect on media. Prue, what are you hearing from people over the last week? We know many, many thousands of Australians are losing their jobs or having their employment altered. What impact is that going to have on media?
Well, media houses are looking out of the next 6 months and seeing their advertising revenue just slashed. And that is going to have huge knock-on effects for a lot of media houses that are, operating on slim margins. The sad thing is that readership has skyrocketed because we're all sitting at home, watching for each update, and we need it more than ever. But they're not able to monetize that if the advertisers don't have the money to pay for it. So it could be a very, very dark time for Australian media, and it could look very different on the other side of this.
Because we know a number of local papers have now effectively asked their staff to stand down. They're hoping that they'll be able to reopen, but it's not clear. Some of these papers have been around for more than 100 years.
Yeah, and we're hearing News Corp expecting to lay off journalists. I saw the bosses are even taking a pay cut, so things must be grim. So if it's and I've certainly heard that some of the other larger media houses are also really worried about their future. So if it's even News Corp worrying about its future, then it is very concerning for smaller papers.
So, Prue, is this the kind of moment where Australian media outlets should be thinking about alternative business models? I mean, we're just seeing this push to its limits, the advertising revenue model, the impact of digital publishers who aren't being asked to pay for content. We've had this ACCC inquiry that came out last year. Is this a moment to have that conversation, or is it your fear that it'll go much further than that and make those conversations quite difficult?
I hope it is. I've been struck by coming back that Australians seem to not value media in the way that I do, and hoped that they would. I think, you have to spend a bit of time, you only have to spend a bit of time in countries that have no free media to understand just how important that is in a society. To think about vast parts of our bureaucracy going completely without scrutiny. I mean, you just have to think about that for a minute. I mean, the corruption that has been uncovered by the media in Australia, even in the last 20 years, has been staggering. Imagine that all happens without any fear of scrutiny is extraordinary. Or even just making the right decisions. It may not be corruption, it may just be ineptitude, and that's not being, there's no pressure to actually, shape up and do the right thing. And also, we don't learn this great experiment worked, and this innovation has taken off in West Australia, and the rest of us learn about that. So many things are impacted if we don't have a high quality media, and I'm troubled that we seem to be less aware of that than Americans are, and there are a lot of reasons for that. A lot of Americans do think that democracy is going to collapse tomorrow. It's part of the reasons they have so many guns.
But also a Bill of Rights. So.
Right. Well, a Bill of Rights, exactly. And so they do feel they're talking constantly about their rights being taken away. And this is one of them. So freedom of expression, freedom of press is something that they are constantly talking about. And I think the media there in that world is able to actually then drive home the importance as well. And they do it. I mean, they do highlight heroic journalism, and they do a good job. It's more fraught here and difficult. But I think it's something that we need to be thinking harder about and talking more about.
Ben, what are your thoughts? For 25 million in the US, we've got 330 million people. Where we keep leaning on that as an example, but it is an interesting one. There are obviously cultural similarities and differences. What models are you hoping that Australian media will look to? Do they provide some positive, role models for what we might do next?
Well, unfortunately, Elizabeth, the market has failed. So I think that relying on the free market to provide the level of news media, information, and democratic debate that we need in our democracy is probably folly. And I think we need to look at some other policy mechanisms. So I'd like to see a big increase in funding to our public broadcasters, the ABC and SBS, but I'd also like to see the federal government take a more proactive approach in regulating and indeed taxing the software platforms like Facebook and Google that now dominate online advertising and then really suck up a lot of the revenue that the news media used to rely on to pay journalists to be able to exert scrutiny on the very powerful in our society. And I think there's actually a lot of scope to do that. I think ordinary Australians increasingly recognise that the current mediascape that we have in this country is impoverished. And I think that they would be open to looking at some policy mechanisms to take some revenue off those big tech companies, which after all are run by unaccountable overseas billionaires, and maybe directing some of that money, not just to the public broadcasters, but perhaps to some of the independent media, whether that be small-scale independent web publishers like your Crikeys or your Schwartz Medias. But also, I think we often ignore the impact and the importance of community media like community radio in providing critical news and information services for a lot of Australians, millions and millions, in fact.
Ben, I was listening to a conversation that Campbell Reid, an executive at News Corp, actually gave at the Judith Neilson Institute last week, and he said digital publishers are in a position now, and I'm paraphrasing, but essentially it's as if we would allow news agents to have newspapers decide how they got published and who they got distributed to, and they'd take in revenue for work that reporters and media companies were doing. I'm not entirely sure that we've done a very good job as journalists communicating to the public that this is the situation that we found ourselves in, that Google and Facebook take something like 85% of online ad revenue. They essentially use hard work that journalists have created for their employers and push it out to the public at zero cost to themselves while gathering audience data, attention, traction, and advertising dollars. What is it that ACCC report has done, and do you see the government acting on that anytime soon?
Well, unfortunately, the ACCC report has done nothing because it hasn't been acted upon, right? So even though it's a really interesting report, and I think there's some really fascinating policy recommendations in it, by the way, I don't think it goes far enough, but perhaps I would say that. But it's all kind of moot, isn't it, really, because the federal government has not acted upon any of those recommendations. So the ACCC report on digital platforms is just sitting on the shelf, gathering dust. And in the meantime, of course, our mediascape continues to be more and more dominated and oligopolized by overseas media giants, tech giants. So I think it's a really big problem. I think you're right that the media hasn't necessarily done a good job of explaining the problem to ordinary Australians, but I think, again, it goes to that trust deficit whereby ordinary citizens are pretty skeptical of what the media's got to say, especially when it's talking about itself, which is a big problem for the media in general. And they tune out, I think. They're pretty happy on the whole, the surveys say, with the kind of information they're getting through their social media platforms. So even though they recognise there's a problem of disinformation and the fake news, they also, they use a lot of Facebook. Ordinary Australians use social media platforms all the time. And so there's a problem there in terms of being able to get the message across. But there's also maybe a problem with the message itself, which is that I think that ordinary Australians aren't buying it.
Prue, I know we're both followers of the Daily podcast. You and I have talked about that in the past. We're talking about a phenomenon where particularly younger audiences in Australia are flocking to places like NPR, to the New York Times. One, why is that happening in your opinion? And second, do we have an example of another country that's done a good job of rebuilding its local media, its domestic media, and pulling young audiences, which we know we're losing, particularly young women, back into a media conversation?
It's really interesting because it isn't just the CBSs and now News Corp, an American organization, coming and buying local media. It's we operate in a global marketplace, and so I've been really struck that most of my workmates, millennials and younger, are listening to American podcasts, listening to the Daily, getting their news from the New York Times. So we worry about news deserts within Australia, but I think there's this danger that we could become a news desert within the Anglosphere and probably within the Mandarin-speaking world as well. I assume that a lot of Mandarin-speaking people are getting their media that way. So lots of dangers there, but also there is, because there is look, the philanthropy landscape and architecture in America is so profoundly different, and it has been able to fund, and there's also public private equity money that has funded much more experimentation. So there was money to support the Daily. The former speechwriters for Obama have now started Crooked Media, which is apparently making $10 million a year. There's just a lot more encouragement of innovation, rethinking the way things are being done. And I think I was really pleased to see that Schwartz Media and you were hosting this the 7 a.m. podcast that learnt from what the Daily did and emulated it. But I don't see Australian media being given enough rope to try those experiments and find those audiences and reach different markets. But also, it comes down to this question too of diversity. I feel like there are some very big markets that could be tapped if the media could move outside of this one cultural lens through which it operates at the moment. And in terms of countries that have done well, look, there's we are challenged by being English language speaking from that point of view. I think countries that Northern European countries that there are 6 million Danes. They understand if they don't produce the media in their language, they're not going to get it. And because we have so many inputs from other markets, there is a danger that our local media becomes sort of an offshoot of the New York Times.
Ben, I'm interested to hear your thoughts about diversity. We really absolutely need to be working as an industry to ensure that our newsrooms look a whole lot more like Australia does and involve people from all different parts of Australian society. I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. I certainly feel like that conversation is very far behind in my interactions with people working in Australian media after having spent 5 years in the US. And I'd love to hear how you think, or if there are any promising signs about how we could be doing that a whole lot better than we are now.
We do have a very not diverse media in Australia. We have a very white media we have a very privileged media as well. It's very hard to break into the media from the working classes of this country, and if you're not lucky enough to have a university education and a fairly privileged background, it's actually very difficult to get a job in the mainstream media. So that's an element of the problem, I think. And there's no doubt. I mean, look at our panel here tonight. It's three white people. The media often doesn't look like what ordinary Australia looks like. If you just walk down the street, one of the main streets of one of the capital cities of Australia, we've done a very poor job of bringing minorities and Asian Australians, for example, or Indigenous Australians into mainstream voices in our mediascape. And that's to do with a whole bunch of reasons, to do with the entrenched inequalities and privileges by which our media industries are constructed. So I'm fairly pessimistic the media can solve that problem itself, because the media is actually part of that problem. I think it needs to be forced to solve that problem with some labour market regulations and some quotas to actually force broadcasters and publishers to bring more diverse voices into the fold.
By no means am I saying that the situation was very, very far from perfect in the American newsrooms that I observed. Certainly there was a massive class divide, and you had people from Ivy League schools who could afford to live in major cities for 3 months to do an unpaid internship, or that paid $12 a day to get into it. So certainly there are massive problems there. But I hear you. I think what I find interesting at the moment is that we seem Australian media seems to be caught, as a number of industries. I think, for example, housing is a similar one. We're caught between the need for government subsidy and public funding, and we don't have a culture of philanthropy yet developed in, say, the way that the United States might have. Prue, that's what really you're working on at the moment. Can you tell us where you think the role of what you think the role of philanthropy could be as Australia develops that culture? And we've actually had a question from someone saying, how does a concerned public that wants to help encourage philanthropic support of quality journalism, how can they do that?
Well, there are some profound structural problems and we didn't talk about the defamation laws and whistleblower regulations in Australia that are amazing to me, that the chill that they have put on the media here. But obviously, for Americans there are probably 300 non-profit newsrooms across America now, where for an American to give money to those newsrooms is a tax deduction immediately. And we don't have that here. The tax law is not set up to encourage support to media, and I think that would be a good thing to do, is to get to change those laws. And I think we need to explore the non-profit model better. I mean, the ABC and the Guardian, the two that we mentioned at the start of this, are both non-profit entities with not serving a corporate master. As Ben said, there are ways I think that is at the moment the best way to support independent quality journalism. That it's not the panacea, and clearly there's a lot more work to be done. I totally agree that we need to go a lot further in cracking down on digital platforms. And I think that will happen. There's immense push outside of Australia though Australia has been leading the way to a large extent, but there are, huge forces in America now pushing legislation on this front. So I think readers who give voluntary contributions to The Guardian, who take out subscriptions, this is key. We have to pay for news. It costs money. So that's really important. As far as philanthropy goes, obviously the Judith Neilson Institute is the first sort of foray into the big foundation support for journalism in Australia. We are just one, and I've yet to come up with a number in America, but it could be $1 billion a year, literally, going to support journalism in America. I've looked back at almost everything I've done in the last 15 years has been funded by philanthropy in some way, whether it's working with newsrooms in Africa, whether it's the university that I ran that is now named after, ran a department at the university that's now named after Craig Newmark. And just so many reporting trips that I've taken where I've reported in Africa, that's been funded by donors in some way and foundations largely. So there is a huge difference, and I don't want to pretend that philanthropy is going to solve any problems in Australia as it is, but hopefully the Judith Neilson Institute can be a catalyst to other philanthropists out there to start valuing media and seeing how they can be impactful in supporting it.
Ben, your thoughts quickly. We've got a couple of questions that have come in from Facebook, but before we jump to them, your thoughts about philanthropy and where it might be best placed in Australian media.
Oh, it's good. We like it. It's great when people want to give money to journalism.
Oh, can you hear that? Good.
Yeah, no, we like it, but I don't think it's the answer, unfortunately. I don't think it's a panacea. I think long term, if we want a healthy news media, if we want a healthy public sphere in this country, we're going to have to pay for it. And so I think the growth of paywalls and the growth of subscription-based media is probably, it may not be the answer, at least not in the short term, but in the long term, it's probably the most robust model. So I think The Guardian in particular has shown that it can work. My understanding is that The Guardian is actually revenue positive in Australia, despite having a pretty good newsroom. Now, I think they're up above sort of 80, 100 journalists in Australia, but they're bringing in enough subscriptions, and this is just people who want to send them money. There's no paywall on The Guardian, but people obviously believe in the product enough to want to send them money. And if you think about it, there's a precedent there in other types of media. In community media, we have some robust community media stations, particularly community FM stations that have been going for 40 years now on the strength of community subscriptions. And of course, in other publishing industries or in other cultural industries, it's pretty common for people to pay for the content and to have no qualms about paying for the content. So I think ultimately the media needs to be able to give people a product that they're willing to pay for, and if they can do that, and if they can nurture an audience that's prepared to pay for the news journalism that we require, then that is the sustainable model. The question I have is it going to happen? And I think the jury's out on that.
Ben, we've had another question just back to your point about the need for specialised beats for reporters, giving them time and space to look at an area closely. Someone's written in and said, read the expertise of journalists. An example is Ars Technica, where editors and journalists are scientists as well. They can sort of better interpret and package and communicate for mass consumption. The question is, do you think this will change in the future, our expectations around the expertise that we demand from our journalists?
I think in the short term, no, but in the medium term, I hope yes. So I think there's lots of journalists out there who are pretty smart people. And I think you're even seeing that in some of the social media spheres during the current crisis. One of my favorite people to follow on Twitter at the moment is Amy Coops. She's a former journalist for Agence France Presse, but she's now a fifth-year medical student. And she's provided some of the most incisive commentary on the COVID-19 situation in Australia from her dual expertise as both a highly trained journalist and communicator and a medical expert. And I think we do need people who can straddle both spheres, who can walk in both worlds, if you like. And I think in the very best examples, we are seeing that in many cases. I'd just like to nominate Ed Yong at The Atlantic, who's been an outstanding science writer covering the COVID crisis as well. And again, it's about both the ability to communicate complex ideas to a general public, but also the intellectual chops to be able to talk to the experts and to understand the cutting edge of the science and to convey that.
Yeah, I mean, I think The Atlantic, of course, I think they deserve a shout out. With 150 reporters have basically mobilised their entire reporting force at their newsroom spread across the globe to report exclusively on corona. They've picked their areas very well that they've drilled deep into. They've made all that content available to non-subscribers. I mean, these are all fantastic things and very necessary in this moment. Prue, one thing I did want to speak to you about, because of course you had, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his last name, Ulrich.
Oh yeah, I've forgotten his last name
a
too.
fantastic Danish name. I had it written down here. It's lost in my. You had a media commentator out from Denmark just earlier this month. In fact, watching the videos, it seemed like a much simpler time with journalists talking about corona as an emerging story. It was only a few weeks ago, but he's really floating this idea and kind of really pushing this idea to newsrooms around the world of constructive journalism. How do we not only paint a world of challenges that, of course, we know we're facing, climate crisis and the spread of a global pandemic being just a couple, but how do we offer hope in a time of despair? How do we mobilize our audiences to understand that there are solutions, that there's human ingenuity, and also how do we not leave them feeling like all we have is a mess of problems? You know, the light stories seem to be confused with fluff pieces, and of course there's somewhere between those two. So someone's written in saying, how can journalists report on both the story and possible solutions that they've found in their research, and do they need to use long form content options for that to occur, or is it possible in breaking and daily news?
I'm kind of mystified that when that left journalism, to be honest. I mean, I started as a cadet in the ABC newsroom 25 years ago, and we were, you're reporting on an issue and you cover is there someone doing it well? It just was sort of part of the deal. And I'm surprised. I mean, look, it's if it bleeds, it leads. And we have been taught to think that, you need to have the most action in the story. And I think we need to think more about, is this actually news people can use? I mean, the car crash that happens to one family is terrible, but it isn't, it doesn't reflect some other societal issue that's going to impact all of our lives. And if you've got a short, news window, maybe the stories should be things that are really impacting people's lives. And of course, there is, it's not just, good news or sunshine journalism. There are things, there are inspirational stories, there are innovations, there are achievements that we can learn from that should be reported on as well. And I think it's about news judgment. I think it's about newsrooms looking at what are the stories today, and we're looking at a range of things that actually are impacting the lives of ordinary people for better and worse, rather than this mindset of, if it bleeds, it leads. We've got to get as much drama and action and horror and blood into the bulletin as possible.
Ben, your thoughts? I mean, how can media and reporters do better? I think in fighting, in a sense, it's despair at the world and at a lack of solutions. Solutions journalism seems to be this corner of journalism when it should be in almost everything we read.
I think we need to get back to basics. Perhaps, that's an obvious thing to say, but I think one of the things that journalists can do that nearly no other types of researchers can do is we can get the personal stories of ordinary people. And I think we need to get back to the grassroots and actually get back to the basics of telling the stories of ordinary people and how some of these big picture events, this pandemic, is affecting the real lives of ordinary Australians. That, in my opinion, is how we will be able to win back trust and how we'll be able to tell compelling narratives, is by actually, doing that basic reporting. And you know it when you read a really great story where someone talks to someone, when someone takes the time, when a journalist takes the time to really get to know their subject matter and to really talk to the people who've been affected in a sensitive and in a dedicated and engaged way. That's a kind of information that academics can't do. It's kind of information that statistics can't provide. So that's the kind of journalism I'd like to see us pursuing, the really grassroots, basic reporting on the ground, out there on the streets, talking to people about what's really happening and how it's affecting them.
Ben, thank you so much. Prue, thank you so much both for joining us on a Friday night. I've got a couple of messages I want to quickly hand over from Knowledge Melbourne. we basically understand that this has been the very first time that we've done a Melbourne Conversation online. So forgive us if we had any tech fails on your end as we got started, but thank you so much for spending Friday night with us. Knowledge Melbourne will be holding another event in April. The next online and live stream event for Melbourne Conversations will be with the Doherty Institute. There'll be an opportunity to ask scientists and epidemiologists questions about COVID-19. The date is still to be confirmed at this stage, but that'll be happening next month. And in May, Melbourne Conversations is going to hear from Dr. Niels Wouters, one of Melbourne's leading AI ethicists. He'll be talking about a social credit system, and he'll be live streamed here on Knowledge Melbourne on the Facebook page, and that's coming on the 14th of May, which is a Thursday. Thank you to the Wheeler Centre for providing us this platform for our speakers so that we could still run the event from home. Ben, Prue, thank you for making the time, and thanks to everybody who's joined us, sending you our very best thoughts at this strange and unusual time. Good night.